Excuse me. Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you're watching the webinar. To my good colleagues and friends at Lake Zurich High School and several others, part of the district team at Lake Zurich, it's Dave Nagel checking in. I wanted to follow up, as I promised, with a webinar that would be recorded that any of you can watch anytime. Perhaps you have a chance to watch in a group or in the leadership team meeting, but either way, something that we don't have to come together live is busy. We always have a busy time, but as we're getting the school year going and everything we're trying to accomplish, I thought this would be a better way to connect with everyone. But as always, please feel free. Several of you have emailed, I've contacted back and forth with some questions and things, and I've tried to go into as many of your impact cycles as I could with comments and feedback. For several of you, if I haven't given comments, I don't ever like to just add comments for the sake of adding them or to say, hey, this looks great. So if I haven't, I think everything is really, from my perspective, on par. So we'll get started right away. This is really just a preparation follow-up for October 13th, that Thursday when we're going to come together, go through some of our evidence we've gathered, and kind of set the stage to put together the rest of our impact cycles for planning here this fall. So just kind of as a review and overview again, the big question we're asking is how are we developing assessment-capable visible learners at Lake Zurich High School? And so to what extent are the students in my class or in my department becoming more assessment capable, monitoring their own learning? And certainly we're going to talk even more next time at the right amount of challenge and rigor level. And then certainly most of us have really focused on what do my students think about learning and how do we learn? Meaning how do we as the students, how do we as the teachers learn? We focus predominantly a lot on teacher clarity. And when we look at Graham Nuthall's work, and I've shared a little bit of his research and his findings, 1,200 observations, a phenomenal read, The Hidden Lives of Learners, and he followed up with The Hidden Classroom. I don't think this is a shock, and I think, be honest, in a school as comprehensive and large as Lake Zurich, with the type of population and student achievement that you have, this is probably maybe even a conservative number. But as a whole, in this research, which covered the gamut of spectrum of K-12 and certainly high and low socioeconomic and high achieving and low achieving schools, but about half the time we're teaching students stuff they already know or making them complete tasks that they already know, and they really could be going deeper. And so this mastery learning objective and the quality there and how students are monitoring their learning really could become a catalyst to make sure we don't have any student, as John Hattie would say, reach their potential. He says it's our job to have everyone exceed their potential. And I also wanted to share, when we look at and I know I've shared this before, the moderating effects in his influence of teacher-student relationships, that the highest is non-directivity, meaning that we don't mandate and guide the manner and path in which not only students learn, but that they demonstrate their learning. And so certainly there's a foundational level or procedural level. For example, in chemistry or any science class, that you have to really have a foundational understanding of variables and independent variables, and certainly in chemistry, some foundational chemical pieces and the periodic table interacts and things of that nature. But then after we get deeper into the actual lab and application, and I'm only using the science example, it can be applied anywhere, that students have a choice in how they monitor their learning. And also in any high school, when students are taking 6 or 7 classes, to realize that not every class is equally important to them, and to make sure we allow them to go deeper in certain areas where they might have more passion. That make sure the rigor level and expectations in all classes where it needs to be. But then when students meet that in my class, maybe they're going deeper in other places. And so one of the examples I'll share today that we can talk about, that is, how are students connecting what they're learning in science to literacy, and how are they connecting what they're doing in social studies to math, and heaven forbid they're connecting one class to the other. So there's ways to really build upon some of the initial work we're doing. And certainly we're looking at all students at Lake Zurich, but really what we're doing with our freshmen and sophomores, even more so to empower them to become what I like to call upperclassmen ready. So that way in several years, they're really beginning to own even more of their learning and make more connections from course to course, class to class, things of that nature. So kind of reviewing the just overall impact learning cycle or impact cycle process is we have some focus questions. We've determined we're in that gathering evidence stage to determine for us, not only what are my students' learning needs, but we're also viewing yourselves as leaders, whether administrator or department chair, what are your teachers' learning needs? And then what are your learning needs going to be to support them? What we're going to work on then as we come together in a few weeks is what are our plans to implement specific changes needed and how we'll monitor that throughout the rest of this semester and into January. And I think each group will be a little bit different. Todd's group will be different, monitoring PE and health than it would be for Lauren in language arts. And so just looking at how we view the monitoring, I think what that will also set up is we can schedule at certain times when different people are reporting out, or we're all not reporting out at the same time. We really have a chance to learn from each other. And I'm really pleased and excited with some of the impact cycles that have been started, those of you that have started gathering evidence. So I wanted to just highlight again where we've been and where we're headed. We're really at kind of steps 1 and 2, going into 3, coming into October 13th. We're in our evidence gathering phase. By October 13th, we need to make our baseline evidence statements and then choose our focus area. And predominantly, we're going to all be, I think, in similar areas, whether it is teacher clarity. We're going to talk a little bit more about challenge and rigor. But what will be important is, and I have found with any group, but especially if I'm working with a large group of classroom teachers, and certainly a lot of you are still in the classroom, even though you have sort of a leadership role, the ability to realize that there's an intentional piece to say, what are my learning needs? I might need to learn more about how to really increase clarity in my discipline, like foreign language, which might be a little bit different than it would be in PE or health. Or I have the ability to look at what does rigor really look like for my discipline, which might be different than others. But there's a specific step in the process to give you time to focus on your learning needs. We're going to talk about that a lot. And I'm thinking between October 13th and around Halloween, just because that's kind of a nice time frame, that might be where before you push any of those required changes, you focus on what you might need to learn first. And we're not looking at the end of the semester as the end of when this impact cycle has to finish. Certainly that's a nice time. We have kind of a break and change classes maybe after finals and things of that nature. But that doesn't mean we have to be in such a rush that we don't allow everyone to have a chance to figure out what are my learning needs. And certainly I think we're going to have some that are similar, and we can have some co-learning and sharing of new ideas and things going on with the group. Why we need to ensure we gather quality evidence. And to be honest, I've gone through the impact cycles. I don't think anything with what you've scheduled in terms of your plan would eliminate from quality evidence. One thing I'll share is a few places where I've offered some thoughts on some additional questions to pyramid off of some of the ones you've already determined, but is to establish a baseline where you're going to begin your journey for you, your teachers, and the students. Where do I really need to begin? And it's quite possible for some departments they're beginning at a different place. And again, I'm going to go back to Todd's group, and the PE teachers are looking at a large group of students at the same time. And not that everybody doesn't have a challenge, but I just think a PE situation is different than language arts, to where we might be looking at their needs differently. So that we don't begin everyone at the same place for the sake of starting there. And when we think about it, that's what we do with our students sometimes. We all kind of start on page 1. We want to make sure we don't do that. To understand where their current knowledge levels are, we might have, because teacher clarity has been stronger in certain disciplines and certain subject areas, more of the students are more aware of what the mastery learning objective means. Maybe in some departments it's less. How are students really thinking about learning and connecting that and to their classrooms? And then how are the teachers reacting to that? That the teachers realize, okay, these students really are focusing so much on getting the task accomplished. Maybe not only is that a learned behavior before they ever entered the high school, but maybe that's something that we perpetuate at times. And then develop a specific focus for this impact cycle that supports you in working with your teachers and students directly. And again, from a perspective where Ryan's at and the other administrators, that's a little bit different, because you're working with a large group of students on a different level, sort of at a 20,000 foot view. Department chairs maybe more 10,000 foot view. Kent even a little bit higher, Jody a little bit higher. So where you can feel like your focus really empowers you to know, are my actions having the desired impact? And that's really what this is about. We set a course of actions and we really monitor the impact. And I use a lot of sports metaphors, but I think about your football team. I would imagine, maybe even posted in the locker room, basketball as well, you might see something like, the criteria for success for football. We want to have more than 200 yards rushing and hold the other team under 100. We want to win the turnover battle. We want to have more rebounds than the other team has. We want to shoot more free throws than they make. The point is there's going to be some look-fors that we can monitor along the way before we get to some of those more measurable pieces, like 5 essentials data and things of that nature. So, and even Brian and his team, they've already developed a survey. That's great, but that certainly is a little bit more time consuming. We can do that survey again in January, but we can look for things along the way so we don't have to have the hard evidential data. If we know, hey, if we're winning all those turnover battles and we're seeing more students respond on a daily basis, we'll give that later assessment. We'll play the game on Friday, but we probably have a better chance to know where we're at without having to always feel like we have to document every single piece of hard data. And some of those anecdotes that we're collecting, not just one, can really begin to empower us to make adjustments in our actions. Just want to share a couple of the impact cycles, and what I love is everybody has access to it. I believe this is Tiffany's. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it is. And what I've done is just gone in and made some comments and read with some of you. But the question, how does this connect what you learned yesterday? A lot of you added that into yours, and I really think that could be an empowering item of evidence. Not only are students making that connection, but are teachers intentional with sometimes that mastery learning objective stays up for a couple of days. It doesn't have to change daily, but we're looking for that next step. The students are making a bigger connection, especially if it's conceptual. And just a thought, not that there's anything wrong with how you get feedback on meeting the objective, but a parallel question, meaning we could ask that one or a pyramid off it, but how will you know when you've met the mastery learning objective? Because that in and of itself implies the feedback the students would get from themselves, from their peers, or from the teacher. I know I've met it when I've reached this goal because I'm looking at the criteria for success and I'm empowering myself to know that I've met it, or my peers are helping me. So I don't think that it's an either or in terms of which question that Tiffany has here in red. And this is why I just shared there was another one. A lot of you had this question, what did you connect to yesterday? I don't think it's an either or. I really think it's an and or. We could use both questions. And then I just wanted to share again, Brian's group. I forgot everybody that was in it, so I apologize. I don't have the document up in front of me. I know it was several. But looking at the survey that they're going to use to gather evidence. And so here was their survey. I think they do have 200 respondents. I'm curious, I made the comment to Brian and your team where you're at, maybe kind of gathering some of that. And certainly I'm happy to help because I think there's a lot of items that students responded the same way, and there's nothing wrong with that, but how we begin to kind of dig into that. And, how does that objective compare to the essential question of a broader topic of study? My one thought to that, do students understand what that means? And so that's where I think we don't obviously change the survey, but we dig in with some follow-up questions because we're kind of looking for that conceptual understanding or the big idea as Larry describes it. So I think, as I mentioned before, having multiple pieces of data, we survey all them, but we're looking when students respond to that broader topic with maybe some other questions like, what does that make you think of? How do you tie those pieces together? Certainly the broader topic would be much more open-ended that comes from an essential question or a broad type question to drive that big idea, that conceptual understanding. So what's really important, though, is we come together on the 13th and we have our impact statements that succinctly describe the evidence you've gathered. Here's the inferences I can make. And we're making inferences. We're not making final judgments. And include a comparison against your baseline statement. So we have our baseline statement, and then we have the evidence to back it up. And then compare progress to the targets you're going to set. So your baseline evidence statements should be something that while we make generalizations, they are measurable to a degree, so we can look in 12 weeks or 14 weeks when we come back together. Then here are some examples of some baseline evidence statements. These are things that I shared last time we were together. The one above is a little bit where the students understand when they get their assessments back, which really should be a part and parcel to the mastery learning objective. That should be part of what's on our assessment. Students, 68 of 84 viewed feedback in the form of grades or points, and only 17 commented anything that helps them learn. And then what was also added to that statement was students connected good learning to the grade the teacher gave them. And again, students perceive that. The grades are done to them, and at times they are, but at other times, well, maybe it's because you didn't quite learn what you needed to and demonstrate that yet. And to help them realize, and I think, Ryan, on your focus group questions, there was a lot around digging into grades, and I offered some thoughts there. So certainly grades are a part of it, but also having students realize I should have an A when I can fill in the blank. I think that's a great place to push teachers back on is, what do students have to demonstrate in the mastery learning objective to get an A or to get a B? And their response shouldn't be they have to complete their work. It should go back to evidence of that learning objective, which certainly implies they're going to do some work, but it's not a completion basis. So, and here's a few others. And again, you have these slides as well. The majority of our students state what they were learning or referencing the learning target. That should be MLO, Mastery Learning Objective. And then that bottom one, the focus group. The majority of the students in the focus group thought of the good learner listens, stays in their seats, take notes, and studies. Those are good study habits, but not necessarily good learning habits per se. How do we dig in deeper that it's not just the behaviors, but how I use those notes and apply them and looking for those strategies that help students learn. It's also important, a couple points I want to make, to separate evidence we're gathering from the teaching that we may or may not see. So several of you put on there that the teacher's referring to the mastery learning objective. We might not see that. But if students are continually articulating on a deep level the learning objective, how it's applied to the criteria for success, we can make a strong inference that it's happening, but we have to ask students questions. So I wanted to just share, this is another piece of Graham Nuthall's research. I shared with it last time. 1,200 observations, 72% of the time the students were seated in groups or pairs, but 81% of the time they were working alone. We won't know that unless we ask the students. We could walk by the room and we could see a group sitting together and think they're collaboratively learning, but we have to ask questions to dig in. So the point I'm making is if we want to see what is happening in the teaching, we might not observe it, but we can certainly see evidence of it over time as we're asking students some of these questions, surveying them, things of that nature. Another example, and this is some example of a baseline evidence statement that you will make. So this came specifically from the middle schools in Valley View. Teacher clarity was sporadic. Some teachers write learning intentions and success criteria. They write mastery learning objectives, criteria for success, but students haven't made the connection to the work. And they did 61 visits, 61 students were asked, and did not make connection to the success criteria during their learning unless they were in science class. And so that's why this is where you might, as you're asking students questions or you're gathering evidence, what's enough disaggregation? There's a point where we can have paralysis by overanalysis, so we try to dig too deep. But certainly a lot of you monitor multiple classrooms, multiple teachers, multiple grade levels, geometry versus algebra, English 9 versus 10. Is there a different place where you can say, okay, it's happening more there, which then leads, when we get into our learning needs for your department and your team and the school as a whole, some teachers might be demonstrating during your professional learning and your PLCs more than they're the ones doing the learning. And so what might help you dig in there? And so if you haven't finished gathering your evidence, this is another place to maybe think about, how do I want to make sure I separate it enough so I can be empowered, so we don't make the erroneous assumption that students, for the most part, don't get success criteria and realize that there's a place that they really are, and we can look for clues to replicate. So at the end of the day, when I say, what are my students, that's also the students and the teachers. Steps 1 and 2 is really where you're in. And so the only comment, suggestion I want to make, and maybe you've collected the evidence, but maybe haven't added into your impact cycles, is we still have a good solid, in fact, 2 weeks from today left, to kind of dig in and to make sure that we're collecting the right amount of evidence. Less evidence of quality with good questions is more than a lot that we can't make some quality inferences of afterwards. And I want to share another example of baseline evidence statements, literally, that I worked with in the last week since I've seen you guys. Students found it generally difficult to recall what they specifically were learning in this school's daily objective, your mastery learning objective, how it helped them learn. And most of my students stated they would know when they'd learned the criteria for success when they got their paper back with a grade. They then had their data underneath that in terms of the number of students asked and surveyed. So what I'm just kind of sharing is this is a common concern, not just with Lake Zurich, or a common place where students are struggling to make that connection, but also a place where teachers are making the effort, getting their daily objective, mastery learning objective out there. And at times it takes a little bit more focus, but to dig in, are the students making that connection? So finally, what we'll do when we come back then on October 13th is develop our focus area, or focus areas. And again, each department will kind of have their own, but I would challenge, or I would be surprised if we're not all on the same page, and they're very similar. But I want to make sure that we understand there should be an empowerment, that you don't have to do exactly what your peer is doing, but I think we'd all be steering the ship in the right direction, as we talked about the need for the red-black, and that we're all moving in the right direction. And what students are doing in English, they apply in science. I'm really not concerned not only with the focus of the team and the desire to move together and be collaborative and do the best for the school. I just think by default, all of your focus or impact cycles, they're already steering in the right, similar direction, not right direction, but similar direction. But then another thing we'll do is we'll then determine our focus area and what are some of the required changes. So for example, that school that I was recently with, one of the groups said they wanted to improve their students' ability to explain how they connect literacy into their science classroom projects and tasks. And so what we'll determine is, what do me as the teacher, myself as a department chair, what do I need to do to get that to happen more? What would my students or my teachers need to do more? And then parents as well. We'll talk a little bit about them, and certainly they play a role. And to kind of bring them up to speed. And I don't know where we are at with emails or newsletters or things like that. My son's in middle school, and I know Family Next was as a high school student, and teachers send out weekly updates, and they have a website and things of that nature. And it's communicating with parents what they're learning. And certainly it's connected to the grade, but it doesn't live and die just in that final grade. And so the focus of our planning on the 13th will be to determine that focus area, determine your learning needs, and we'll talk more and talk a little bit more in depth on success criteria and places to dig in and go deeper. And certainly what you've done with Sapphire shouldn't go away. And to dig even more how we apply that. Identify the required changes for yourself, for the teachers you work with, for the students, and the parents. Students need to make some changes. But if students are going to make changes, the teachers might need to make changes first. If teachers are going to make changes, we might need to empower and focus some of our PLC time on that. And then set some targets to begin to monitor. Step 7, 8, and 9, that happens between October 13th and when we decide to kind of come back together. And I'm envisioning that to be mid to late January. That doesn't mean some of the groups might not start reporting out between now and then, but really we're kind of digging into steps 3, 4, 5, and 6. And again, step 5 is where I'll probably budget the most time for us to work in small groups and then report out. If we want our students to explain more what they're learning and how they'll demonstrate it, what would that mean for you? What would that mean for you in terms of your leaning and then supporting your departments and supporting how we're looking at quality mastery learning objectives, maybe some learning objectives that need a tweak, but then after that, we dig for that understanding and make sure also that the tasks and lessons we're doing with the students connect to that. I think that will be a big piece for some teachers, not for all, but sometimes we have a great objective, we have a great plan, but we're going back to what our old or previous lessons or tasks or things we've done before, and it's incongruent. We asked for a flathead screwdriver because we needed a flathead screw, but we had an old Phillips, so we just kept using it. So it might be being more intentional with aligning our lessons and our tasks to what the objective is. What do students need to start doing more in terms of monitoring their learning? And again, we talked a little bit, parents and families, but it all that goes down the cycle of if I want the parents, then I have to do something. If I want the students, I have to do something different. And then we'll talk a little bit more about how we set up the role of the impact partner, how I want to encourage several of you, and maybe it's something that happens a little bit during your regular meetings, but where you'll meet once in a while or discuss or share, and certainly I'm happy to be a part of any group, how you're gathering evidence, a sounding board, kind of keep each other on track in terms of, hey, we're going to collect this evidence, I'm going to bring a statement to you, I want you to look it over and tell me what you think, and to collectively problem solve. We're looking at a challenge in foreign language, and we're also looking at it in English, we might find a connection, and even though the pedagogy is a little bit different, that collectively we might make some connections together, and we're sharing the same kids anyway. So wanted to wrap up again when we did our red-black activity, and I really appreciate everybody sort of, with all due respect, being a good sport, because it is an activity where myself as the leader kind of sets the group up to have the results come as they did. But I think all of you have conveyed tremendous work ethic, desire to make Lake Zurich the best high school it can be, and all of you are giraffes. You want to stick your neck out for the kids. You want to make it the best school possible for all of them. And I really compliment the ability for me to come in and let you lead me and guide you a little bit. I appreciate your questions, and also appreciate times when you've said, I got it, just let me go, and be there when I'm ready for any questions, Dave, and support. That's what my role should be. So if you have any thoughts or questions between now and then, do not hesitate to send me an email. I've said I've gone into several of your impact cycles. If I haven't, or if you haven't seen any comments, it just means there's really nothing more for me to add, except for maybe a couple comments on this webinar that were very similar to yours, but I wasn't just going to go put something in red to just do it. But I did look at all of them, other than getting some evidence in there, and I really would follow up with an email by that Monday before, I believe that's the 10th. Anything you could have in there by then at the latest lets me prepare even more when we come together on the 13th to make it as useful and productive for all of your time that you're investing. Have a great weekend, and I look forward to talking with everybody soon.